from the Humane Society, from Q's Pit Crew, and the draft legislation. It's all up here on the counter.
Could you pass me a please? Or that they're making copies, separate copies of those?
Humane Society?
Okay, thank you.
I haven't even read it yet. Thanks, Addie. Thanks, honey. Okay. More letters. I think these are the same letters, in case you run out.
Get the sound.
Does anybody not have the legislation? Do you have it?
I think I've got it.
All right, then we can get started. Thanks for coming, everybody. My name is Susan Boyle, and I'm the 3rd District Common Council representative. And we are here today with Joe Carney, Councilor Joe Carney, Councilor Joe Driscoll, Majority Leader Steve Thompson, Councilor Tim Rudd, Shane Chimber, who is our dog control supervisor, Julie LaFave, the Deputy Commissioner of Parks and Rec, and Officer Rebecca Cosgrove, who works for our dog control division. Syracuse Police Department.
Cruelty investigator.
Syracuse Police Animal Cruelty Investigator. So thanks everybody for coming. Today we are going to discuss the passing of the draft legislation of what is referred to as Adrian's Law. This law was initially presented to the county legislature. It was not passed on the county legislature, and we believe that, or I believe that we should pass it in the city of Syracuse. Hopefully my counselors will agree with me. Adrian was a pit bull that died in the city of Syracuse. He had shelter. He froze to death. He was tethered. And I feel that this is a serious problem in the city of Syracuse, and I'd like to see some laws around protecting our animals and some restrictions around the keeping of the animals in the city of Syracuse. This law would make it illegal to leave a dog tethered with a chain or rope outdoors without adequate shelter in 90-degree weather or 32-degree weather for over 2 hours. So that's the general outline of it. I would like to just, if anybody has any questions about what actually the legislation is, I can answer those, but I think we all have a pretty good idea of what we're talking about. So I'd like to just start with Joe Carney and sort of get to the gravy.
Okay. So
the gravy train.
So I guess first, this legislation would actually just address the tethering of dogs, because the state already has legislation that speaks of shelter and what defines shelter and what proper shelter is. So this would just more specifically go after the tethering of dogs in what is defined as extreme weather conditions, weather alerts, and just outdoors between the 32 Fahrenheit and 90 Fahrenheit. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, the tethering of the dogs, not the shelter itself.
Right, the tethering during those conditions.
Now, I guess a couple issues I have with the way that it's written. First is, again, part of it is the way the ag and market sort of defines their their provisions for weather. It's a little vague in my view, but that's more a state issue than anything we can control here locally. Now, along with being out, one of the things it says is working dogs. It's my understanding that a working dog could be essentially almost any dog that gets defined as a working dog. Like if it's an emotional support dog, my Shih Tzu could be, a working dog, and it shouldn't be left outside. So is there a better way to either A, define it, or B, go about it saying, weather conditions, like a Malamute doesn't want to be outside in 75-degree weather, let alone when it gets up to 80, but it probably is okay with being outside in 30-degree weather. I mean, is there, from your view, is there a better way to define it legislatively? That would be a better way for your department to address it and go after offenders.
Well, the truth of it is, rarely do we have any issues with working dogs.
Shane, could I ask you to pull that right up there?
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Can you hear me? Typically, we have little issues with the working, quote-unquote, working dogs. But if that's an issue, that's easy enough to change the definition. I mean, we could call it city domesticated dogs, whatever. I mean, if that's the issue moving forward with this, it kind of, like I said, we rarely have any issues with that type animal.
Sorry for my ignorance. What's the distinction of a working dog? How does one classify a working dog?
It's funny because it's kind of more of a definition. There's really no state law. Like, you can pretty much nowadays, you can go to ARC and you can go to them if you need emotional seizures, whatever, and they have you can label your own dog as a working dog. They do, not to mention, they do have these dogs that are trained, but they also, people can bring their own dogs and get it labeled and documented and have the papers on it.
Yeah, like my concern would be is just very little research that I did trying to lead up to this. Like Doberman Pinschers can be defined as a working dog, and
Sure.
That shouldn't be left outside in either extreme of weather. It's not prepared for that. Whereas again, Saint Bernard is a dog that probably enjoys being out in the snow more than that dog, and would be able to handle something like that. But again, when you get to higher temperatures, even if you're not hitting that 90-degree threshold, it's still not safe for that dog to be outside. So I would be curious about the enforcement of it, how prepared and capable you think your department would be to be able to do that. And then, I think it is 2 hours is the way that it's written in this. I apologize. I was just sort of given this a little while ago to understand what our draft is going to be, because there were a couple floating around the county. With the 2 hours, how would we address that? How would we go about doing that? Is our department prepared to handle that?
The city dog control or the Syracuse police?
Either, both, all the above.
So we had the discussion leading up to this that we would come up with some kind of procedure for the police department and our dog control office. There would have to be some kind of procedures, because Officer Cosgrave could go out at 1 p.m., notice the dog, but it hasn't been 2 hours, but have to relay that information to our dog control, so that way they're working on the same team and calculating on the same hour. So we would come up with some way to work together to address it.
So, Joby, Counselor, before you go, could I get from somebody an overview of what the existing law is now, and then I mean, I notice in here that it says that the market and agricultural, what are our standards today, and what are we trying to get? I can see where we're trying to get.
We have no tethering law on the books right now. As far as the agriculture and markets goes, it's the sheltering where you start off with. It deals with what kind of shelter, what kind of, and then you go by breed and weather conditions, where you live. But city of Syracuse, there is no tethering. This is a brand new situation.
Do you feel like we need it?
I do, yes.
And would the primary, I'd imagine the primary enforcement in this would be complaint driven, right? Like a neighbor sees their people leaving their dog out for 8-hour intervals, right, and they call it in, and then, then you have some tool to deal with it, right?
Like any other violation, like the dog control officers have license violations, off-leash violations. This is the same thing. It's a violation. You can either arrest by direct observation or witness statement, and you have the neighbor, I've been watching this dog for 3 hours, it's out there suffering, and you get a statement from that, and you make the arrest for the violation.
So this could be enforced by potentially by visual observation by police or dog control, and it could also be enforced by deposition?
Yes.
Good.
And again, I know we have a lot of things to work through, but like when I look at this, it just makes sense. I mean, it's reasonable, it's prudent. When you look at this is what every pet owner should be doing anyways. And quite frankly, it's sad that we have to come up with legislation to get people to do the right thing with their animals anyways. Like when I read it, it made sense to me. It jumped out at me. I thought it was a great idea, and it puts a little more teeth, and maybe it allows us a chance to make a difference before we have these things happen.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the spirit of the law. I guess my issue is just the actual nuts and bolts and what makes this up. I mean, in theory, I agree with you. It's a common sense thing. Don't leave your dog out in a tornado. I mean, but the fact that we have to tell people that is an issue. But
the enforcement counselor, I think we've worked out a lot more difficult situations than I think this. I think this is very doable with getting together and coming up with a plan. I mean, the dangerous dog laws are crazy right now. So, and we've come up with a thing that I think that works, and I think we can do that with this as well.
Do you want to move along? Do you have any questions, Joe?
No, I think it makes sense thus far.
Steve?
Well, my question was to hear the overview of what exists now. Nothing exists now is what you're saying.
Correct.
The classification or definition of what a working dog actually is, because people could take that to different. In one person's head, a working dog is something. Another is when it's just part of employment or whatever. What is it? What being used for? So.
Right. My suggestion to that would be if the dog control officers had an issue with that and someone wanted to argue that, they could call me, and then I could come, and then we can move into the state agriculture market animal abuse laws. Maybe it's got frostbite, maybe it's injured in some way. We can always take it a step further. It's not a roadblock.
My other question would be how many would you say that of these situations that you respond to?
A lot.
Okay.
Yes. A lot.
More than a lot. Can you say a number?
To break it down, I respond to about 600 calls, probably a couple hundred for the heat in the summer, a couple hundred for the cold in the winter, and the rest is starvation, stabbings, beatings.
And what do you do now with these?
Educate, bring them in. Or if they're already injured, then they go into the state laws and they get arrested for misdemeanors. But this is trying to prevent that from happening. If we can stop them before the animal gets injured, it's better for everybody.
Thank you.
So currently that, if you report to a call and the dog appears lethargic or showing signs of hypothermia, I mean, that isn't that something that you can
That's an
currently
immediate
address?
emergency.
Wouldn't that fall under the state's
Yes.
law for neglect?
That's a medical emergency. That would go under animal cruelty, the section 353 of the Article 26.
So then what is this really addressing other than just simply
Before
the dog
that
being
happens.
tethered?
Typically, that kind of thing
Or what?
would happen after the dog's been
Yes.
outside for 2 hours and can't move.
This would prevent dog control officers and myself to do something prior to that happening, before the dog gets lethargic and before they freeze.
So what you're saying is that if you saw a dog now that was tethered under today's conditions, you saw a dog that was tethered, and you drove by and it's there at 8 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, it's still there. Today, you might proactively just stop in and say to the owner, hey, it's 90 degrees out, the dog ought to be inside, versus having something that you could have at 10 o'clock stopped and said, listen, there's an ordinance here that says after 2 hours, the dog has to go back in the house. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to ticket or start an enforcement end. It means that you're going to have something to actually go in and speak with them about, correct?
Right, exactly. You have some teeth to what you're saying to them.
Councilor Rudd, did you have some questions?
I had 3 questions. One, Councilor Carney kind of gave his answer toward it as he asked his own questions, which is what exactly is the difference from the state law, and Councilor Thompson also asked it, and I still feel it's a little vague from my not being a dog
Where it becomes
person
state
expert.
law,
But so
What's
when
the
you were
distinction?
describing,
the distinction.
I understand it's about tethering, but
Yes.
the state law, you kind of breezed into breeds and temperatures and
That's for sheltering.
for sheltering.
Yes.
So does this law reflect that level of nuance that exists in the state law around breeds? And
no, this was meant for any dog, just simply to stop anything from occurring. The sheltering is for people who keep their dogs outside. You can't keep a pit bull outside whether their structure is firm or fit or waterproof if it's still freezing to death, you know, and it's not appropriate shelter if it's a pit bull that can't handle it. Maybe it's appropriate shelter for some other type of dog that can handle the cold air. But the distinction between the violation that would be the city ordinance and going into the state will be some type of uncomfortable, some type of injury, the dog's starting to show distress. Now you're moving into state laws. Before that happens is where the violation is in the city. We don't want to see distress. We don't want to see frostbite. We won't want to see any of that. Because once you do, then you cross the line into the state laws.
So what's the science behind the thresholds? I understand 32 degrees is freezing, but relative to dogs, and then 90, and then 2 hours, because I originally think it was 30 minutes in the county legislature. So like, what is the science that goes into those choices?
These numbers came when it went in front of the county. It was what the general population was comfortable. It was not what was originally submitted.
I have brought these numbers and temperatures to a veterinarian, and they have stated that this should be passed as written. But I do have some feedback from the community, hoping that we would go back to the 30 minutes. I'd love any feedback.
Can I touch base on that? And I think when I read this, I mean, let's be honest here, 90 degrees, they're still giving that person the benefit of the doubt, because my personal opinion is 80 degrees, 85 degrees is probably too hot. 32 degrees, what you have to remember, yes, it's freezing cold, but that ground is colder than what the air is, the top surface I'm talking about. So like when you see these dogs standing on a doghouse because they can't be on the ground, so yes, you're giving them actually 32 degrees, but really and realistically, it's still too cold at 32.
Is 32, the governor opened up the shelters for people at 32, right. So, I mean,
yeah.
You know. And you have to remember that ground that dog's standing on, that's tethered.
Yeah.
He doesn't have any room. He doesn't have any place to find the little bit of warmth that he needs.
Is it your opinion that 2 hours is an appropriate amount of time?
I think in reference to move forward.
For dog safety and for enforceability.
I think it's a starting point.
Do you have an opinion on that?
I believe it's a bit too long.
Too long?
Is there, I understand, I appreciate you going to a vet to ask, but like, is there documentation that like report from vets or organizations that show the sign? I mean, I've never tethered a dog because I have a fenced-in yard, and my dog always liked to be inside, and I think that's the way many people are. And you want to be with your dog, so you enjoy them. But I've also had family members in the country who have country dogs whose dogs are tethered almost their entire life and spend the vast majority outside unless there is an extreme weather event, and it's not 30 degrees. And they do have, and that's where I think the shelter, like what type of shelter applies and what type of dog, but how, I guess it seems like this is a broad blanket, so I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, I think it was meant to be broad, so we weren't tying it down to certain things. Different dogs will react different ways. Some dogs don't show that they're cold, but they are. Some will shiver, some will lift their paws, some are stoic, and some will curl up and act like they're dying. You know, they all react different ways with these. So it was left general and left up to the officer to make make their own assumptions about what's going on and observations, and let the officer do what they want to do with that.
I don't think the law currently does this, but could it include an exemption where somebody who does tether their dog, who feels they do so in a responsible manner based on their breed, could kind of get permission, so you know they're doing it? I assume there's probably a dog that likes to be outside or that handles it, and there's some that don't.
The problem with that is you can have a husky standing outside. His paws are still going to freeze. His body's not going to be freezing, but his paws can still get frozen.
That's where the tethering part.
He's in one spot and that's stuck to the ground, and he can't run away and he can't go anywhere else. He's still going to get frostbite.
So is it tethered without shelter or just tethered, period?
It's just tethered. Doesn't matter if there's shelter or not. The dog who had this, Adrian, was one of my dogs that I knew before he died and froze to death. He had shelter that it was appropriate according to the state. He was tethered and he froze to death in his house. So this is whether they've got shelter or not. And we're just strictly going with the tethering. And I'm sure Shane will say this too, we've worked with animals for so long, you know that around 32 degrees the dogs are going to start getting uncomfortable. You know you're going out there and checking on them when the temperatures are below that. And I'm sure there is documentation somewhere, I don't know, but my direct observation is that they do start to become uncomfortable at these temperatures.
So I just to sort of follow, it's twofold. One is I agree with you on the science behind it. I know when there's neglect, there's a way that, you know, when you collect all your information and turn it over to the district attorney, you can prove that that dog is malnourished. There's science behind it, and there's a way of proving it. And that's, I guess, where I sort of, when we're coming from the legislative side, and we're drawing up a law that's going to be followed, how do we then convert it from, you know, you press charges against a person, the district attorney takes it, and then they go into the courtroom and they have the ability to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. That's always my concern when we do some sort of punitive law.
Right.
I guess my hope would be is that going forward, that we can find some sort of science to back up what we're looking for in a time period and why we're doing it that way. And then I had another question.
Are you looking for a statement from a veterinarian?
No, I'm looking for actual science, not just a just a friend that's a veterinarian. I'm not trying to be rude.
Friends who are veterinarians.
I'm not trying to be rude, but just because your friend says they like it, or a veterinarian that you talk to says they like it,
not my friend.
All right, okay. Well, someone, the veterinarian that you spoke with, there's got to be some sort of science behind it, and I'm confident that it's out there, but I'd like to see it when we're going to draw up a law.
My third question is around the examples when Counselor Thompson asked the questions about volume, and you said you get about 600 calls a year, a couple hundred in the summer for heat, a couple hundred in the winter. So of those, how many times do you find yourself lacking a law to support you in your work, and such that this would actually change what you can do?
Most of these calls are before something bad happens. So I would tell the owner, take the dog out of the car or put them in the house if it's freezing outside, or it's too hot, get them water, bring them in. You know, those warnings we do every day to people.
And you don't feel people are generally compliant?
No, you'll go by it in the next day and it's the same situation again. Me telling them to bring their dog inside, or the dog control officers telling them to bring inside, it's my dog, I can do what I want with it. And you're like, okay, because there's nothing I can do to stop you right now until your dog is dead, and then you're going to jail. So we don't want that to happen.
And
what's the fine?
Yeah, it's on here.
I know, but I'm just
in the violations.
The first offense is $100.
So this is a violation, is that correct? I'm asking law. Joe, can we respond to that? Or is it an unclassified misdemeanor, or what is it? It's a violation?
Yes, a violation.
So every offense is a violation in here?
Yes.
Okay. So in effect, it's similar to a traffic infraction or whatever. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody else have any other questions?
It would just go through the main city court process, like.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, does this outlaw tethering altogether, or just simply tethering in these weather conditions?
Correct.
Okay.
In the city.
Everything we do is just in the city. County doesn't let us tell them what to do.
Not yet.
All right. If counselors don't have any other questions, I'd like to. We have several people who came who I think would like to address the council. So if anybody would like 2 minutes on the microphone, you're welcome to speak now. Anyone? And just if you could state your name and where you're from.
Sure. Hi there, I'm Stephanie Heath. I'm reading a letter on behalf of New York State Director for the Humane Society of the United States, Brian Shapiro, who could not be here today. However, I do work full-time for the Humane Society of the United States. The Humane Society of the United States, representing our members and supporters in the city of Syracuse, is pleased to support Adrian's Law and urges its passage. As the nation's largest animal protection organization, the HSUS stands with local law enforcement, including the Onondaga County Sheriff's Office, County District Attorney's Office, and of course the Syracuse Police Department in calling for passage of this law. During snowstorms or extreme cold, dogs kept outdoors often lack access to adequate protection from precipitation and freezing winds. Cases of animals left outside in dangerous weather are one of the most reported incidents of animal cruelty identified by the HSUS and local SPCAs and humane societies. But current language in New York's agriculture and markets law makes it difficult for enforcement officers to take action before a dog has suffered injury or death due to exposure. We respectfully urge a favorable vote on Adrian's Law, which will save lives, provide important tools for local law enforcement, and create safer communities. Thank you kindly for this opportunity to present. And just to, if you don't mind, I just wanted to address Mr. Carney's, what you were talking about with the 32 degrees. One issue that just wasn't mentioned here is at 32 degrees, the water, outdoor water freezes and food freezes. So if a dog is out there for prolonged periods of time and they're attempting to either ingest snow or drink that frozen water, it can actually cause physical harm to their bodies inside as well. So that's just something I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Hi, my name is Aaron Santangelo. I'm with Cuse Pit Crew, and I too would like to read a letter on behalf of Cuse Pit Crew. Dear Honorable Common Council members, Cuse Pit Crew, a nonprofit organization based here in Syracuse, is proud to support Adrian's Law. Our focus is on education and dog abuse prevention through our programs such as humane education, shelter outreach, and political action. Through this action, our end goal is to end abuse and neglect of dogs, many of them being pit bulls and other bully-type breeds. Each year we receive dozens of emails and phone calls from concerned citizens throughout central New York regarding dogs left outside in the bitter cold and excruciating hot temperatures. Many of these dogs exhibit symptoms from the direct exposure to the elements, causing them immense pain and suffering. Furthermore, for the dogs that are tethered, they're physically restricted from following their natural instinct to seek a cooling or heating source. It is a fact that some dogs have heavier coats than others. However, all dogs have the same pads and extremities that are susceptible to frostbite. The area veterinary emergency clinic treats dozens of dogs a year for frostbite, overheating, and death due to improper care in our extreme winter and summer months. Sadly for Adrian, he was just one of the many victims. His death was long and painful. Fortunately, we have the ability to end this unnecessary cruelty. We urge you to give law enforcement the tools they need to protect the most vulnerable while they're on the front lines. We urge you to follow other local government entities and communities that have chosen to take action. We advocate for the passage of Adrian's Law. We sincerely appreciate your continued efforts to protect our dogs and people in our community. Thank you, and we look forward to this continued partnership. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nancy Canavan, and I'm with on the board of directors of the Onondaga County Federation of Sportsmen's Clubs. A question to all of you. Earlier you were talking about working dogs. Does the definition of working dogs also apply to hunting dogs, whose definition would be legal for a hunting dog, and have you identified certain breeds for that?
Hunting dogs have been exempted in this legislation.
And whose definition of a hunting dog?
As this is written, it would be up to the animal control officers to determine that, I guess, right?
It says a hunting dog shall mean any dog that is trained to aid in taking of wildlife and is actually or has been used for such purposes consistent with applicable law or regulation, including environmental conservation law. and local
Earlier,
permits.
you were discussing working dogs. I'm assuming that that also included hunting dogs?
Yeah, they're actually spelled
They're
out
both
separately.
they're both
You can take a
they're
copy.
separate, and they're both named in the legislation. There's a
Thank you.
category of exemption for working dogs and for hunting dogs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anyone else like to say anything or speak? All right.
Oh, we got one more.
Hi, my name is Joan Albro. I'm not necessarily against the law altogether, but the fact that you are pretty much going after tethering is kind of a problem, because I think there's adequate tethering and then there's inadequate tethering, and the fact that that's not really being discussed, it's just all tethering. What about the people that go to work and put their dog out before they go to work, so their dog doesn't have to be crated all day long? I mean, not all dogs can be loose in the house. So really, those dogs are going to be affected by this bill, because now they have to worry about, well, do I leave work to go put my dog back in the house, even though my dog has enough shade, has enough water, has adequate shelter, is completely fine. They are still going to be targeted under this new law.
Well, if the dog has adequate shelter, it shouldn't be a problem.
Well, who decides adequate shelter? Are you going
I
back
think
to
the
the
state of New York
guidelines?
has the laws. The state of New York has
'Cause it
adequate
doesn't-
shelter laws.
What is it saying? And your guys' thing is that 2 hours no matter what.
No, it's saying 2 hours without adequate shelter, tethered.
Okay.
And
Well,
and also only during extreme.
During extreme weather.
So on a 50-degree day, this doesn't address
but
that.
90 degrees in a hot day isn't really that bad if they have adequate shelter.
If they have adequate, but then
And
they
shade
they
and
wouldn't be in
water.
violation if they have adequate shelter.
Even if their neighbor, so if their neighbor calls and says, "Oh, this dog, I know this new bill is out here," they're not going to be affected
if
by
they
this.
have adequate shelter, they can stay. If they have adequate shelter as defined by New York State, then they should be fine. But that would include a temperature-controlled doghouse.
And the next problem is with the tethering. If you're going to tell people that they shouldn't tether, then they're going to do some kind of makeshift dog kennel, dog crate outside, probably. And then you're going to run into dogs jumping fences. I own pit bulls.
Well,
and
that
they
would
can-
not be considered adequate shelter.
a dog, but it's containment, ma'am.
Right, not
So
shelter.
even if they have, because you're going after tethering instead of just saying dogs left out, period.
We're
That's
going
one of the
after
things.
tethering in certain conditions,
outside.
just in certain conditions. In
Right.
certain weather, extreme weather conditions without adequate shelter.
I understand what you're saying.
So if you were to take a dog and leave him in a heated doghouse or kennel all day while you're at work, rather than tethering, that would be acceptable.
But what I'm telling you is that most American Pit Bull Terriers can scale a 6-foot fence. So you're putting tethering on and not going over
So what
the
you're
other
s-
containment
what you're saying
problems.
what you're saying is that if you hit a fenced-in rear yard and you just let the dog out the back
Yeah, now
for
they're
the
gonna.
for the purpose of the whole day,
Yeah,
that's what you're speaking of.
yeah. There's people that do that. I mean,
And my recommendation would be not to do that.
correct.
To leave your dog outside if you're not
I
home.
think the
That would
safest
be my
containment is tethering,
recommendation.
to be really honest with you, because as long as it's
Tethered
proper-
or untethered, I don't think that you should leave your dogs outside in your yard if you're not home all day while you're at work.
Well, I don't
That's
think
just my
that they
opinion.
should be left in a dog crate all day while you're at work either.
Well,
I
we
mean,
we disagree.
The working breeds get neurotic if you leave them kenneled in a
Okay.
dog crate all day long, and that's what
Well,
that's
then
who I'm here
freezing-
on behalf of.
But if
not-
they can
not
scale
your
a 6-foot
pets.
fence, how are you going to leave them untethered outside in your yard?
I don't leave them untethered. They are tethered. I already
That's
said
what you're
the
arguing
safest way
about.
to contain them is tethering.
Okay.
The concern is that and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think the concern that she's stating is that we're going to start seeing folks leaving their dog untethered in the backyard,
Yes,
and now we'll face a whole different issue, and
because it's
I hope
the
that
focus
doesn't
is
happen,
tethering.
but
That's
I
what
understand your
I've
argument.
just sat here and listened to everyone talk, and what I get out of it is tether. You guys are really focused on tethering, and the problem is responsible ownership. That's the problem. Like,
I agree
but your
100%.
gateway into it is you
100%.
got to try to. I don't know how you guys are going to get a better gateway in, but the tethering focus is going to really affect the responsible.
Well, if you're
people.
truly a responsible pet owner, you're not going to tether your dog outside under 32 degrees or over 90 degrees.
I most certainly do, ma'am.
Okay,
My
well-
dogs are in very adequate conditions, and I do tether my dogs
Okay.
outside. I do bring them in if it drops below 30 degrees, but they're outside when it's 90 out. But
Okay.
it's cooler where they are than it is in my house.
Then I would say you may be subject to the violation or possibly even to the state laws. if you're doing those things. Those are unsatisfactory conditions for animals
Not
outside.
if you have adequate shelter, ma'am.
Okay. Do you have a heating condition in your shelter?
Yes.
And
they
air
have heating
conditioning?
lamps. All dog houses have heating lamps, and they're insulated.
And air conditioning for the 90 degrees?
No, it's below 90 degrees where they are. They're
Okay,
in a
so then it's
shaded
not
area.
90 degrees then.
Sorry,
I'm
ma'am?
talking about 90 degrees. If you're telling me it's below 90 degrees, it's not 90 degrees?
If it's 90 degrees at my house, it's about 15 degrees cooler where they are.
Okay, so then it's not 90 degrees where they are. If it's 90 degrees where they are,
Correct, ma'am.
And they have
Correct,
adequate
ma'am.
shelter.
Yes.
then
Your
it's
dogs
correct.
have adequate shelter.
Yes, I'm just saying what you guys are trying to do is great for the dogs that are living in poor situations, but if you guys start affecting dogs that are not, that's where the problem lies. So instead of like attacking me and going over my little words that I'm not getting right, I'm just trying to help you guys see that there are people out there that do care for their animals, and just because they are tethered and they are outside
we
doesn't
know
mean
that,
that they don't
and
care
we
for their
evaluate
animals.
each situation as we go to them.
I'm sorry.
We're not, we know, we understand that, and we're not attacking people.
I'm just
We're not
here
going
on
to use
behalf
this.
of those that cannot be
We,
here that
we
do-
evaluate each situation as we go to
that
it.
do take care of their animals.
I just that brings up an interesting point that how and again this is actually key to the legislation. How are we going to enforce the temperature and weather? You know, I mean how are we going to go about doing that? Like, are we going to go out there and first hour we're going to put a thermometer there and figure out
What's acceptable to the ADA's office is that I will go through the National Weather Service and print out where at Syracuse, New York at 12 o'clock it was this degrees. I print it out and I put it right in the case. It's perfectly acceptable to them.
Okay, but what if in a situation where it is, heated or cooled in that, shelter that they built?
And that's what we evaluate. If I
That's
go there and they're
adequate
heated and they're sheltered, then it's not a problem.
Yeah, I think
That's what
I think we're leaving some
investigations-
room for discretion for the officers, and if the owner in such a case should disagree, they can take that before the court and say, I don't feel this is accurate, and I don't, but
Right.
but it does give you the
Responsible
tool.
dog owners who have adequate shelter for their dogs, like you do, shouldn't be affected whether you tether or not, as long as your shelter is adequate shelter by the state law, not by our law, by the state law.
Yeah.
We're looking at people who do not have that kind of shelter that you have for your dogs, who still choose to leave them outside tethered in
I hear two
extreme
different
weather
things though,
conditions.
because she just said that you would be subject to enforcement, and you just said you
Well,
wouldn't
no,
be.
she said
So-
she would be subject to enforcement when she was
But it's
under
over
the
the 90.
understanding that she was leaving her dog out in over 90-degree weather.
Yes.
But then she said that her dog isn't left out in over 90-degree weather. It was just a...
The issue is if the dog is in shade, Tim, which is technically the officer could still ticket her for having her dog out if by the writ of the law it's over 90 degrees and she's left her dog outside. But she's saying in the case where the officer would be left to have discretion, or in the case where they could take it to court then and say, this doesn't apply to me because my yard is shaded and I have adequate shelter as provided in the provisions of the state law, which this works in conjunction
But
with.
Adrian, in theory, correct me if I'm wrong, was in adequate state shelter.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay.
That's why we need the law.
But he was tethered outside
But hold
and froze
on.
to death.
To go along with that, yes, it was waterproof, it was this and that, but it wasn't correct for his breed and the temperatures, which is also guidelines for that law. You have to have the weather conditions, the breed, and the structure. Okay?
But where does it say in here any of that? That's my issue.
We're not-
I'm
we're
not
not dealing-
saying I'm
we're
not
not
against
dealing
it.
with
Really
shelter
adequate
in here.
shelter. It was a decent shelter, but it was not
But it was
insulated.
adequate by state law.
No,
and yes,
it
that's
wasn't-
No, because it wasn't
was.
breed
It was
specific,
not
which is included
insulated.
in the state
Wasn't
law, as she
insulated.
says, right?
And this has nothing to do with shelter in this law.
But technically, that doghouse was not code because it wasn't insulated, and it didn't have a hinged door.
And what I'm hearing from you, officer, is that if it were even acceptable standards, it wouldn't have worked here because it was more than 2 hours with the tether.
Yeah, and it was a pit bull with the short hair, and there's a lot of factors with that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I understand the story of Adrian as a tragedy. If this law were in place, would Adrian be alive? And in that, I kind of mean, did somebody show up and say like, oh, you should bring your dog in, and the person failed
Absolutely.
to do that?
Dog control was there and told them several times. I was there and told them several times. I took that dog away from them one point about a year or two ago. They were giving it back.
So this law would have saved that
This
dog's
dog
life.
would have saved the dog. Yes, absolutely.
Why was the dog taken away previously, if you recall?
Too cold. It was too cold outside. He was freezing.
But you were able to take the dog away that time, but
because
yeah.
Now we're into the state law. I took that dog under state law.
Okay.
But yes, prior to that happening, dog control could have went by them and say, oh, this dog's outside. You know, we want to stop that injury from happening. That's what this is about.
Dog was injured when you took him.
Yeah.
And I'm not disagreeing with that. I guess that just where I'm coming from is we're trying to put together the best piece of legislation. I don't disagree with this in spirit and the idea of it. I guess my issue and what I'm trying to bring up is things need to be better defined than as is here, and reasons why they're defined. Because look, if it should be 30 minutes or it should be an hour, we need reason, proof, and a way for an ADA to go into the courtroom and say, here's the law, here's the science behind it, and here's why, and this is why this person needs to be fined, arrested, or imprisoned for whatever purposes. So that's what I'm getting at here with all of this. I'm not against this law in theory, but as it's written, I have issues, and I think it could be cleared up better, and we could put together a better piece of legislation.
So did somebody from the district attorney's office work on this?
I don't know. Was Anthony? Was he showing this? Anthony Johnston. He's the one that handles all the animal cruelty cases for this county. Was he?
Did he see this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Seen it, but I can't say whether or not he's.
I don't think we had any. Yeah, we didn't have any conversation with him about it.
Okay. And what specifically, Counselor, are you looking at? I mean, you're saying some things, so I'm trying to see
honestly, it's a number of things. It's, is it better defined by breed? Should we go and review what the state legislation says about each breed and how it is, and then does it need to be better defined in there? Do we need to discuss or better define what a working dog is? And, so that, I guess, is where I'm coming from.
Related to the period of time, the 2 hours and the science behind it, so would you want a definition of under what condition, how long does it take frostbite to set in at 32 degrees? Because if it says 3 hours, then maybe that justifies the 2 hours because you want to limit it before it happens.
Exactly.
So some kind of science like that.
I understand that this is
so when does heat exhaustion at 90 degrees, how long does it take to set in, and how long does frostbite take?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
About something else with the tethering that hasn't also been talked about. Somebody may have a responsible owner may have a great setup in their backyard for tethering and adequate shelter, and that's fine and well. But when you're looking at tethering, the other risk factor is that people have trees and they have other structures in their yard. And so dogs tend to get wrapped up and roped up around things. And that is seen often by law enforcement and dog control. When we get emails and calls, somebody says there's a dog outside and he can't reach his shelter because he's tethered and he's tied up on the tree. Somebody can't go help that dog and trespass. So that's a major issue and a risk factor that we haven't addressed yet. Another issue with the science behind freezing what happens to these dogs. It's a very difficult thing to actually have, other than we inhumanely can't test that, right? We can't test that theory. What will happen to a dog if we leave it outside in the snow or the cold or something, because it would be considered inhumane to do, or in the heat. We have anecdotal stories from people in veterinarian clinics and hospitals and law enforcement to say, this dog's been out for this long and this is what's happened. The #1 reported animal cruelty by the Humane Society of the United States and local SPCA's is this: dogs who are left outside in the cold and the heat and then are symptomatic or result in death. So that's what we have to go on, because we don't have necessarily the an immense amount of research to back that up. It's just not there.
My last comment is just kind of in general about how to approach local law, which I think Councilor Carney is kind of echoing also. But there were moments where we talked about this is a broad legislation. It kind of empowers the officer to make decisions. And I understand why government wants that ability to be flexible, but I also understand why people feel genuinely concerned about feeling like they may be they may be subject to the law when they feel they have been responsible. And that creates, for law-abiding people, to be subject to the whim of an enforcement officer is uncomfortable, to say the least. So I do think it's important in general, whether it's for codes or dogs or people or whatever it may be, that legislation be clear and people know that they're in violation or not, and that if you're in violation, it should be very clear that you weren't doing the wrong thing, I think. So, like, I don't feel that the woman who spoke, that she's irresponsible necessarily. And
have you read the state definition for in the sheltering? Have you read the breed, the climate?
No, I have not.
Okay. I suggest you look at that. That may be something that you want to have the language of that in there. That might make you feel more comfortable.
That does exist.
So that would be something I would suggest that
you and Joe.
Whoever.
I'll get it for you and Joe. I'll get it for the council.
And that we consider how it could be incorporated into this local law.
It is. It says right there. It says right there.
It's factored in with the state
Yeah, it
law.
says under
one of the first
outdoors.
paragraphs. It's talking about
It cites the
agriculture and whatever, wherever.
All right. Well, can we like insert the actual?
Here it is. Here it is.
Right there, second paragraph.
Consistent with the provisions of New York State agriculture and market law.
I guess can I just have a sheet that describes the conditions?
Yeah, I have it. I haven't had a chance. I mean, we were literally just given this
everybody just got
legislation.
this,
I
so,
looked it
yeah.
up. I have it on the computer, so we can go through it.
I'll get it for you.
Yeah.
I'll get everybody those copies. So going forward, does it appear that we need to be a little more specific about what a working dog is? I'd like to also introduce Councilor Green. Joined us a little late. And do you have any?
How many officers work this kind of beat? One? Makes sense.
Just me.
And how many are in dog control currently? That
We're down to 3.
3. Okay.
All right.
I know it was unrelated, but you mentioned the craziness of violent dogs or whatever local law around that. Is there
That's a talk for a whole nother conversation.
a whole nother conversation?
Yes, that is a much longer conversation.
Is it going to be a conversation sooner than
That would
later?
be-
I know you're working
to,
on it.
I've
more
talked
than
to
that.
Jason and Shane about it. We're in continual discussions about what's going on.
All right, let me wrap up this meeting, and then you guys can talk about other laws. But thank you, everyone, for coming, and I'm excited to move forward on this, and that'll do.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.